Um, so when I think of ecological justice, there's one important preliminary comment that I want to make. A lot of people think about ecological justice and they identify the notion of ecological justice as justice for nature or interspecies justice. I come at this important topic from a very different vantage point, which is to argue that ecological justice is about resetting human nature relationships. And those relationships look very different depending on where we are, who we are talking about. And this is quite at odds with setting up this nature society binary and fighting for rights of nature. That's one part of what I wanted to start with, but also thinking about relational perspectives are obviously not about being anti-nature or arguing against the rights of nature and non-human species to thrive. Instead, the argument is that the only, and I really want to emphasize the only part here, the only effective way of ensuring ecological justice for both human and non-human communities is to reset the relationships. And I focus quite a lot on sort of institutionalized forms of relationships that many have argued is central to the agenda of decolonizing conservation. And this idea of decolonizing conservation in different ways has become so popular that you probably can't come across a talk on nature conservation without at least hearing some references to indigenous people and the sort of commitment to respect their rights. And in fact, WWF, IUCN, and all of the big conservation NGOs have been on this agenda of respecting indigenous rights for at least 20 years now. And I say 20 years because 2003 was the Durban Congress, Conservation Congress at IUCN, where they sort of came out with this a very significant commitment to recognize and respect indigenous rights. And they popularized this concept of rights-based approaches to conservation. There was also a consortium of big conservation NGOs committed to human rights and conservation. I don't quite know what's going on with that consortium right now, especially with the recent formal and institutionalized revelations that WWF has been quite actively engaged in human rights violations, despite at least 2 decades long advocacy, their very apparently vocal advocacy for the rights of indigenous people. Now, this contradiction, you can see this as a big moral failure, which obviously it is, but I see this as an institutional question, because WWF is not just a group of individuals who are going around doing things, but they are part of an institutional matrix, which is the sort of scaffolding for the structure which supports global conservation. How do we engage with that institutional structure so that we can proceed to the goals of ecological justice? And what I want to do in the first part of this talk is to actually lay out the evidence of rights violation in a new way. And as Tahani pointed out, there are very few people on the critical conservation side who do either a quantitative kind of analysis or even take a policy kind of approach. And that's where I come in. And so hopefully these discussions and my talk will be quite complementary to what we have heard so far in this series. And I've listened to some of those presentations, and I hope to listen into more of these as they become available. So when I heard about the big conservation NGOs committing themselves to this approach of rights-based approaches in conservation, the first question I asked myself was, how is it that they are hoping to do it in practice? And so I conducted probably one of the very few independent analysis of what is it that this rights-based conservation looks like as they speak about it, right? Not from a critical perspective, but sort of a social scientific analysis of their approaches. And what I found was that these reports were full of very lofty arguments about territorial sovereignty and all kinds of really utopian kind of ideas about how conservation should change, which is great, right? But then you ask the question, what does someone like WWF do to ensure territorial sovereignty of indigenous people? And of course, we can take a broader view of territorial sovereignty and think about sovereignty in context, multiple sovereignties. And so that's fine, you know, they can probably contribute to that. But they should have an understanding of what the challenges of territorial sovereignty look like in a globally conserved world and how they want to reset it. So I went about doing this kind of policy analysis. And what I discovered was that they actually had very little specifics to sort of chart a pathway to where they wanted to get. They were making all kinds of statements and rights were instrumentalized. And this is really crucial. Every time you heard of rights, it was for the sake of ensuring conservation and achieving the conservation goals that the big conservation NGOs care about. I was looking very hard to see for one sentence where they would say, okay, if there is 1 hectare of subsistence land that a family farms for their survival, we will not violate that space of 1 hectare. And we will yield to the subsistence rights over whatever activities we are doing to promote conservation. I did not find that one sentence about that 1 hectare of subsistence farming being protected by conservation NGOs. And this 1 hectare is not actually an exaggeration that I'm utilizing to make a point. 1 hectare is the most common, the median landholding of most indigenous people in the world. And this is also important to understand because the discourses and narratives of indigenous rights have been popularized in the Americas, both in North America and South America, where indigenous rights has a very different history and a very different politics. And I would say that politics is actually on the good side in terms of being very progressive on many, many fronts. And it's not comparable to indigenous resources, political capacities, political rights, political abilities for the majority of world's indigenous people who live in Africa and Asia and other parts of global South other than South America. So I argued in 2013 that one, there should be more independent scrutiny of the rights-based approaches to conservation, and that conservation NGOs should commit to protecting minimal rights of subsistence and livelihoods like the 1 hectare argument I talked about, and that conservation NGOs should work strongly to hold the governments accountable instead of actually thinking that governments are the tools that conservation can use to create larger and larger areas of protected lands and protected areas. That's what they've been actually doing. So even though if you look at this graph and you look at 2000, that's when the commitment to rights-based approaches started. Since then, they've really ramped up. And now you know that we are at over 17% of territorial protected areas, and the goal is 30% by 2030. So when I looked at this huge expansion of protected areas, I wanted to look at the distribution, and you can ignore the big red Greenland on the top because that was not part of the analysis. But the red areas and the dark orange areas are the areas with the largest percentage of national territories that have been set aside as protected areas. And what you see in this diagram is that some of the most poorest countries on the continent of Africa and North Africa and Asia, um, and even actually parts of Latin America, especially the territories and lands that are inhabited by indigenous people who are among the poorest people within Latin America, for example. So there's this stark contrast between the argument that you need to be rich to care for environment versus the empirical reality that the distribution of protected areas is disproportionately in some of the poorest areas uh, where you have indigenous communities and other kinds of rural communities who are dependent directly on forest and other natural resources. And these are also areas with lots of conflict around land rights and forest rights and other kinds of rights to do with this question of conservation versus human rights. And all of these data are, from, so this article is from Conservation Biology. So obviously, and this is quite old, so obviously conservation community recognizes there are these problems. So what I did was to conduct an empirical analysis of 137 countries, the distribution of protected areas in 137 countries throughout the world, and looked at the ways in which economic inequality, political inequality, which is a combination of democratic institutions and economic inequality, shapes the national level designation of protected areas. Now, obviously, I'm not arguing that if once you set up protected areas, its conservation has happened. Obviously not. But once you set up a protected area, you guarantee that the poorest indigenous people, poorest people relying on protected areas are exploited by local forestry agencies and forest guards and rangers who utilize the legal structure of protected areas to extract rents and to perpetuate exploitation of all kinds, which includes real serious physical harm and sexual exploitation and all of those local outcomes that you can imagine. But remember that that process of local exploitation is undergirded by or is underwritten by this institutional structure, which includes both the legal structure and the allocation of resources. And so what I found in this research was that democracy per se at the national level did not really undermine the goal of setting aside protected areas. In fact, if, apples to apples, all of that quantitative stuff tells us that democracy per se actually has positive effect on percentage of national territory designated as protected areas. But within the group of democratic countries, the more unequal a country is, the lower the amount of protected area. So imagine the world being split now into two sort of different worlds, or you can think about two different worlds in all sorts of ways, right? So imagine these two worlds being democratic countries and non-democratic countries. Within democratic countries, an increasing level of inequality actually puts a brake on the percentage of national territory set aside for protected areas. On the other hand, within the group of non-democratic countries, the percentage of national territory designated as protected areas increases as countries become unequal. And it's a very basic sort of political economy argument that in unequal democracies, the poorest people don't have the wherewithal to actually protest the violation of their land rights and other kinds of rights. And again, political scientists have not looked at this argument in the same way, which is interesting. So the largest protected areas in the world are actually in the poorest countries with poor democratic institutions with high levels of inequality. So we are perpetuating historical inequalities in real time, and we are actually pigging back on the hugely screwed up global institutional setup of democracies of various types. And we are especially utilizing the coincidence of inequality, poor democracy, and high levels of poverty and indigenous populations to set up the largest areas in the world for global conservation. And so this actually tells us that all those inspirational, aspirational arguments that conservation NGOs make would actually probably amount to very little as long as this institutional architecture of conservation is intact, and in fact is being now strengthened as we speak in the context of climate change. And I'll bring in some more of that in a moment. Again, it's very important to remember that while the network of protected areas is responsible for violation of human rights, it's not an effective tool of global conservation. So we are not even achieving what we argue we want to achieve by setting up protected areas. And again, there's tons of research from natural scientists and conservation scientists which suggest that the present approach to setting up global protected areas is not effective. It's not working. And I think that's not a news to most of you in the room here. But there's quite a lot of but none of these articles, to the extent I recall, discuss the underlying political economy, which means that when you sleep with the devil, which is the domestic elites within Global South. And so that again puts a different kind of shade on this sort of notion of North-South colonialism, which is part of this story, but actually is not the full story. So when you work with domestic elites to expand protected areas, what you get is this number. What you get is these various kinds of protected areas set up according to these political economic calculus of inequality and exploitation. And that's that sort of contrast of the expansion of conservation in various forms and its ineffectiveness continues in the realm of offsets and nature-based solutions as they've been tried so far. And for those of us who work in critical conservation, we've been sort of, shouting out about this for a couple of decades now. But now even the business press actually recognizes that the offsets, they use phrases like junk carbon offsets, and it's being fake carbon offsets and spurious credits and all that stuff. And many of these largest projects are actually sponsored by big conservation NGOs such as Nature Conservancy. Despite the evident failure of these both state-based top-down protected area as well as laissez-faire market-based offset kind of approaches, the global conservation community is doubling down on the approach, the market-based approaches to conservation. And I'm sure this argument has come up before, but as someone who's focused on institutions, as in rules, norms, and systems of conduct that govern our affairs, I'm very attentive to how are we framing these debates. And so I want you to look at, this is the Montreal Common Biodiversity Pact that everybody's been talking about, and it's quite celebrated. It's actually mainstreamed market-based approaches to conservation like no other document before in the history of conservation. Which is, again, if you say, okay, maybe they believe that that's their instrument to achieving conservation, that's fine. But the underlying sentence here talks about the biodiversity governance protocols being designed to reduce biodiversity related risks to businesses and financial institutions. So biodiversity is causing risk to businesses and financial institutions, and the proponents, the advocates, and the self-proclaimed um, holders of the morality of biodiversity conservation in the world, they want to reduce biodiversity related risks to business and financial institutions, which is a very interesting way of putting it, right? It's not reducing business risks to biodiversity, but reducing biodiversity related risks to business and financial institutions. And of course, they make all the noises about people and, uh, indigenous people. And, there was all this fight about global South making some demands and they agreeing to it and all of that. So the most common models of institutionalized justice, ecological justice, both for human and non-human species, are essentially an inter-elite global pact at the cost of the poorest people who actually don't have a seat even now, despite nearly quarter a century long discussions and repeated. And one of the reasons that this is happening, and I was able to listen to Esther's talk, and Esther talked quite um, helpfully about the power of framing, which is one part of what's going on. As I argued earlier, and there's all kinds of data, and many journalists are nowadays also referring to these big conservation NGOs as conservation industry. So they hold all kinds of powers at all levels. So this, what the power matrix, and this is one of the articles in a special issue that we published in World Development, is that power, drawing on the social theories of power, has these different dimensions, the three faces of power and all that. We call it as dimensions of power. And conservation NGOs hold all of those different kinds of powers. They are by far, even among the global NGOs, they are by far the richest NGOs with the largest annual galas that they celebrate to raise money and then spend on another set of administrative cost and all kinds of celebrations and parties. And Dan Brockington has done a great service to us to bring out that facet of conservation industry long before this phrase became powerful. But they also hold the agenda setting power, as we saw in the context of the document that I just shared with you. And of course, they have all kinds of discursive power, which draws not only on the universal appeal of nature conservation and environmental protection, but nowadays, even the rights-based approaches to conservation are part of their arsenal of different forms of power that they draw on and utilize to then sort of strengthen their structural power, their power to co-opt, including some indigenous groups and indigenous advocates. And we can talk about that or maybe not talk about that. Or crafting institutions that, at least for now, are working in their favor. But the point of the power matrix was that it really is a matrix in the Matrix movie sense, that you can actually do something about this matrix, again, by intervening at different scales. And I think this talk and many other conversations we have had has had a great success in sort of pushing back on the narrative power of the global conservation and creating our own alternative narratives of indigenous conservation, decolonized conservation, and so forth. But we have to remember that just as global conservation doesn't just draw on narrative power or framing power, we also got to somehow have access to the other forms of power at all levels of this process, so that we can actually challenge more effectively the enormous power that global conservation NGOs and governments hold as of today. So this review paper that we published a couple of years back as part of these ongoing conversations actually sort of lays out not just the first order argument that conservation is colonial and we need to decolonize, but we also go to some length to sort of actually show that these narratives of community-based conservation and rights-based approaches to conservation have been exploited instrumentally by this conservation industry. And so we need to actually think more strongly about what it means to pursue ecological justice in our present context, where the narrative of saving planet Earth has gotten is it's sort of it's a double down version now, because now it's not just in fact many have argued, and I think it's right to some extent, that uh, biodiversity conservation has taken a backseat to climate agenda. And so you have protecting the planet in the name of climate while perpetuating the market-based horrors in all forms, and conservation industry becoming part of this narrative, as well as institutionalized practices and allocation and reallocation of resources from the global community, which includes the poorest people, to, sorry about that, to the this kind of centralized conservation machine as it exists today. So to conclude this discussion, and there are many more discussions to be had also about what does it mean for non-Indigenous people like us to actually advocate for Indigenous conservation. And I have a whole different talk on that, and maybe we can get into some of that discussion. But my ongoing work on ecological justice takes this kind of relational approach, and relational not just at a human, cultural, or social level, but relational at institutional level, to sort of discard the binaries of nature versus humanity, including as they are reflected in this new movement for rights of nature and interspecies right, and instead take an intersectional approach to ecological justice, which actually tells us that the fate of both human and non-human living world is tied deeply to our ability to recalibrate conservation, so that we respect the agency of Indigenous people and scores of other rural and Indigenous peoples all over the world. We should respect and strengthen their agency to nurture nature in a very practical, material fashion, not in a romantic fashion, so that we appropriate Indigenous narratives and say, okay, these are Indigenous people, their wisdom is great, why don't you protect nature for us? That's what is happening right now in the name of Indigenous advocacy, by and large. But there are all of these other experiments at the lower level, which doesn't have that kind of multi-scalar power. It doesn't have that kind of narrative power. And of course, it doesn't have the same kind of agenda setting power, which we need to more seriously pursue ecological justice. But all of that actually requires that we rethink our dominant understandings of environmentalism and ecological protection. Because right now, what we have done, by and large, including in some of the scholarship and advocacy for Indigenous rights, we've taken the older model of conservation and we have said, okay, if only this model could be handed over to Indigenous people, that protected areas could be handed over to Indigenous people. They bring in their wisdom, we retain the institutional structure, and that will lead us to a different world. If the lessons of past quarter a century are anything to go by, that's not a workable approach. And I think we need to be stronger in our resolve to resist materially, institutionally, and of course, in a narrative, discursive, philosophical sense, to make sure that we are displacing the dominant hegemonic models and institutional structure and replacing it with a structure that will allow us to promote a different kind of human nature set of relationships. I'll stop there and hopefully we can get into some of the discussions.